Hello, my friends. My name is Gerdes. I'm just a professor trying to help you have some context on what's going on in the war in Ukraine. Every week, I do a weekly summary of the titles, the headlines that I've seen over the course of the previous week, and then I just unpack a little bit where things need to be unpacked. Sometimes I did a video about it, and I'll point out, hey, I did a whole video about this. Sometimes I just didn't have the capacity to talk about this because other things were crowding it out, and I'm trying to help you understand what's going on. I'm going to roll the clock back to last Monday. That is September 4th. It's day 558. In Pravda, we saw a headline about how more Zelensky firing. There was more about Zelensky firing Reznikov. Reznikov was the previous Minister of Defense, and they were giving him an extra black eye on the way out, as you would expect Pravda to be doing. So Reznikov resigned, and then you would see articles about who is Rustem Umerov, the new defense minister. So Reznikov, it doesn't seem like he was a bad guy, doesn't seem like he was corrupt, but he allowed corruption on his watch. That doesn't mean that he did it, but it happened while he was in charge. He did an excellent job of generating billions of dollars of resources and military equipment from Western partners, but these things happened. So the guy that's replacing him, Rustem Umerov, is a Crimean Tatar, Muslim, has good connections with Turkey, is above reproach as far as we can tell with any corruption kind of issues. And so he's actually a really good fit for what's going on. And Reznikov, it appears, will be going on to serve as, in another capacity, as maybe the British diplomat, the Ukrainian diplomat to Britain. Ambassador to Britain. I'm sorry, the word escaped me. Okay, Ukrainians in occupied areas are forced to vote in a pseudo-election, and that's going on this week, this pseudo-election. And I thought that was really interesting. In fact, I might do an entire thing about the election, just because I went out and looked at the numbers of the election. And if I do this, I'm just a little preview. And the amount that was voting and the amount that voted in other comparable elections, it just doesn't, the numbers don't add up. So look for that. I might be doing that in a day or two. Ukrainians in occupied areas are forced to vote in a pseudo-election. Okay, Scott Ritter came out with another great article in RT. And when I say great article in RT, I mean not great article. Comprehensive Ukrainian defeat is the only possible outcome. Well, you can save having to read that article. You know what he's going to say. Russians carry out 5 missile strikes and 68 air strikes. This was, again, last week on Monday. Ukraine claimed that Shahid was detonated on the territory of Romania. Now, this was big. Okay, this Shahid missile blew up a little bit over Romania, and so that's now sacrificing what we have promised all along. And I did a video about this on Tuesday, where we've said not 1 square inch of NATO territory. Now, I'm not saying that you want to go to war, and go back to that video. In fact, I've done 2 since then because there was another incident. Go back and look at that. I'm not saying you need to go to war over an accident. I am saying if you let this slide, if you give a mouse a cookie, the mouse keeps demanding more, right? You can't let this slide. You have to, and bullies, this is how bullies operate. So there's a psychology here that you can't ignore. Now, the president of Romania made it worse. Bucharest denies the Ukrainian claim that this happened. And so they made it worse by kind of sweeping it under the rug because they don't really want to get going with this. But if that happened in Poland, that would be a very different story. I think Poland might be fairly hawkish about this, or a different place. It might be really concerned about it. Okay, upwards of 20,000 amputees in Ukraine, and the trauma that they're going to face. An RT article about a week ago was talking about how it was, and I did a video about this, how it was 50,000 plus amputees. Well, the range could be somewhere between 20 and 50,000, but there's at least upwards of 20,000. We don't know exactly how many yet, but yeah, again, that was a propaganda puff piece. And then there was plastic, inflatable, wood, and foam decoys, or a psychological weapon. They're using these. So Russia has a few times been tricked into spending a multi-million-dollar missile to destroy a plastic and wood foam decoy of an artillery system and then take the credit for it. So sometimes they're telling the truth about something that they destroyed, but it was a decoy. And so, okay. Tuesday, the 5th of September, the FSB in Melitopol threatens to send children to Russia if parents don't agree to indoctrination. That means send them to school, use this textbook, involve them in military drills in some cases, those kinds of things. And it's pretty despicable. Mikhailo Polodek criticizes the UN Independent Inquiry Commission on evidence of Russian genocide. This just came out, and I'm going to quote here. He said on Twitter on Tuesday that such a position of the UN is, quote, political toothlessness and indirect encouragement of a criminal. He said this, quote, this time Commissioner Eric Moose, head of the UN Commission, bluntly says that they saw no intent to commit genocidal crimes on the part of Russia against Ukraine's citizens. Polodek said, quote, absolutely, because the Russians came to kill us kindly in mass. Ukrainians exactly, but without premeditation. And the missiles are flying into cities every night in a kindly manner. And the attempt to destroy the energy infrastructure in the winter so that people are killed by frost is completely accidental. And a full-blown war for 560 plus days with hundreds of Ukrainian towns and villages wiped out to the ground is strictly within the bounds of acceptable, non-genocidal, and the official calls to kill a Ukrainian are without premeditation, and torture and infiltration camps without compulsion to abandon Ukrainian identity and impose Russian identity is also with love, the ministry of love. When you read his sarcastic response, you get it. No, this is pretty genocidal against Ukrainians. Okay, the SBU announced suspicion of a Russian oligarch, Mikhail Friedman, financing Russian aggression in Ukraine. I'm going to quote again. In fact, I have a lot of quotes in this particular recap. Since the beginning of the full-scale invasion of Russia, he has poured about 2 billion rubles into several military factories of the aggressor country. Wow, that's quite a bit. So the SBU is looking to track this guy down and bring him to justice as a financier. Wednesday, 6 September, the Tribunal for Putin published the first legal assessment of genocide in Ukraine and said, quote, we are convinced that the acts of genocide were committed in Mariupol and the surrounding districts, said Mikhailo Romanov, co-author of the submission. And they took 3 forms: murder, creating conditions of life calculated to destroy a protected group, and the deportation of children. All 3 are heinous. Just think about if your child was abducted and taken just across the city, how beside yourself you'd be, but into an entirely different country where you can't go in order to find them. Just wow. Another quote, the Russians methodically shelled and destroyed people's homes one after another. Snipers shot people queuing up for water or cooking food on a fire outside. Some people died because they stayed in the upper floors with no access and died there of hunger and thirst. During the bombardments, people jumped off the upper floors, unable to tolerate this nightmare. They committed suicide as they no longer had the strength to cope with it all and saw no opportunity to escape. There are many stories like this. It's very sad. Another story, Zelensky dismisses Kirilenko from the post of head of the Donetsk Regional Military Administration. I don't know much about that. There wasn't much to the story, but they are cleaning house and working out corruption kind of issues. This might not have been corruption. This might have just been a better fit or whatever, but they're cleaning house. Pravda had a story about Russia's special services identify Ukrainian colonel responsible for drone attacks. I thought, wow, that's absolutely fascinating. So a warrant, I'm quoting now, a warrant in absentia for the arrest of the rest of commander of the 383rd Separate Regiment of a remotely controlled aircraft of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. So apparently this colonel kind of sold out, and there was another incident fairly similar to that where the Russians are looking for traitors in their midst. Another article, NATO pledges solidarity with Romania over drone debris in Romanian territory. That's as far as it went. Nothing else. Nothing happened. Next, counteroffensive breakthrough, bridgehead salient progress. They are making progress in the south. There's one particular area where they're really significantly making progress. They're chipping away in other places, but really in Zaporizhia, they're making some progress. 17 killed, including one child, in a missile attack on a market in the eastern city of Konstantinivka. I'm sorry, I can't pronounce that. It's a long word, but I think I got it kind of close. And then there were articles about the risks of depleted uranium because it looks like the Ukrainians are going to be getting those shells. Okay, Thursday, 7 September, Konstantinivka casualties are up to 17 dead and 34 wounded. Russia's indignant about the dangers of depleted uranium, according to Al Jazeera, and you see this in Pravda and RT as well. They're now very concerned that that these depleted uranium shells, what's gonna be the long-term impact on the people in Ukraine? Like, okay, I mean that doesn't pass the sniff test if they're writing articles like that. Air defense destroys 25 of 33 UAVs overnight, which means that, there's a handful still getting through, and that's unfortunate. Zelensky introduces Minister Umarov, and he says, quote, "We do not forget that the specific strategic task of Ukraine is integration, the full integration of Ukraine into the North Atlantic Alliance." So Umarov is not just there because he embodies, like, he's a Crimean Tatar, a Muslim, can speak well and has a great relationship with Erdogan from Turkey. More than that, his long-term focus will be integration into NATO. RT says the new Ukraine minister is investigated for corruption, but there was nothing to see there. Pravda highlighted an article which I thought was fascinating. The commander of the Air Defense Army arrested in a grand bribery case. His name was Major General Konstantin Ogalenko, who headed the Special Purpose Air Defense Army that protects Moscow from airstrikes, became a defendant in a grand jury bribery case. Olyenko, together with commander of the 4th Air Defense Division, Major General Dmitry Belinsky, received 500,000 rubles, about $5,000, and then the amount was the first part of a grand bribe totaling 30 million rubles, or $300,000. In return, the military officials promised to allocate land of the Russian Defense Ministry in Moscow, suburban towns, for development purposes, which is really interesting. So selling out to realtors for prime real estate around Moscow. Okay, Ukrainian drone strikes on Rostov-on-Don. Putin was reaching out to North Korea's Kim in a desperate and perhaps dangerous move. Like, if you really need North Korea's help, you're not in good shape. Like, that's the lesson there. And in Russia, there will be teachers who are veterans teaching a practical course on security and defense issues to students. Okay, next Friday, 8 September, Pravda talks about the depleted uranium shells and says this: "Without exaggeration, we have hundreds of thousands of such shells that we have not used yet," Putin said. That's a quote. Okay, we have them too. Next, the use of these shells had very, very sad consequences. Even international organizations documented future generations of people who came into contact or lived in the areas where those weapons were used still have to deal with those consequences, Peskov says. Like, how can you do this to the unfortunate people of Ukraine is the message of that article. And I'm just thinking, like, wow, that's quite, I mean, it's good that you care about the Ukrainians, but if that's as far as your care for Ukrainians goes, and that is as far as it goes, it's pretty sad. Okay, Ukrainians in occupied areas cannot obtain insulin, life-saving drugs without a Russian passport. So you care about them about the uranium, but not about getting life-saving drugs unless they have a Russian passport. So, I don't really believe you about the first one when you're doing what you're doing with the second one. Pravda says that the USA will not be able to stop Moscow and Pyongyang. Like, I'm not sure how adding Pyongyang is going to add any real strength to Moscow, but that's what's carried in Pravda. RT says Zelensky aide Polyak said that Musk committed evil. Now, this is about the reaction to Musk apparently And I'm going to read a quote here so that you have some background. Shutting off Starlink over Crimea. Quote, there was an emergency request from government authorities to activate Starlink all the way to Sevastopol, the obvious intent being to sink most of the Russian fleet at anchor, Musk said on X on September 7th, after CNN published excerpts from an upcoming biography of Musk describing the incident. Quote, if I had agreed to their request, then SpaceX would be explicitly complicit in a major act of war and conflict escalation, said Musk. Musk secretly told his engineers to turn off coverage within 100 kilometers of the Crimean coast. The excerpt from the upcoming book by Walter Isaacson said, as a result, when the Ukrainian drone subs got near the Russian fleet in Sevastopol, they lost connectivity and washed ashore harmlessly. Now, there's competing narratives about that. Um, I saw something about how Isaacson said, yeah, maybe it didn't quite go like that, although he published it in his book, and it's, yeah. So we're not exactly sure what happened here, but there's a lot of controversy over Elon Musk for that reason. Okay, next, Ukraine criticizes fake elections in occupied regions of Ukraine, and that's a big deal. They're going to have sham elections. Anthony Blinken said that, quote, Russia's sham elections in the occupied areas of Ukraine are illegitimate. The Council of Europe has also called them, quote, a flagrant violation of international law. But they're having elections and they voted, like whether it's at the point of a gun or whether they even got a chance to have real elections is beside the point because they will have done it and will be fait accompli. Russia shells several regions. Ukraine claims success near Bakhmut, but there's not really a lot of progress, not like in Zaporizhia. Okay, and then finally, Russian elections strong-arming occupied Ukraine. Quote, when there is an armed person standing in front of you, it's hard to say no. Ivan Fyodorov, the Ukrainian mayor of Russian-controlled southern city of Melitopol, told the Associated Press. And that's really where they are. That's not a free or fair election. Okay, Saturday, RT, U.S. finds a surprise ATACMS just flown over. Hey, we had more ATACMS than we thought we had. Well, whether that's a pretext or whether that they actually found it, either way is kind of not right, but still give the ATACMS to Ukraine. G20 leaders agree on a joint declaration in India after a deal on a Ukraine statement. So here's a quote from that, and it was a watered down statement, no doubt. I'm talking about that in another video. I'm actually going to be on a radio show talking about that today. Quote, there was a noticeable softening of the language around Russia's role in the Ukraine war compared to last year. All references to Russia, Russian aggression, and Russia's withdrawal in relation to the war in Ukraine that featured in last year's joint statement at the G20 summit in Bali were removed. Instead, the declaration emphasized that states must, quote, refrain from the threat or use of force to seek territorial acquisition, unquote, and that, quote, the use of threat or use of nuclear weapons is inadmissible, unquote. In the other video, I just shot the other video. I'm putting this out first, and I'm going to put the other one out later. In the other one, I was talking about how, like, look, if a robber breaks into your home and you talk about, hey, look, violence is not okay, that the violence from the aggressor is different than the violence from the homeowner protecting his family. And this statement just completely ignored it. Okay, G20 statement, stop short of naming Russia the aggressor. Again, another quote from a different article. The summit was also notable for the absence of two key leaders, Russian President Vladimir Putin, who can't travel outside the country without being worried about arrest, and Chinese President Xi Jinping. Both were represented by senior officials. Another quote, the G20 statement includes a set of consequential paragraphs on the war in Ukraine, Sullivan told reporters. And from our perspective, it does a very good job of standing up for the principle that states that we cannot use force to seek territorial acquisition. Okay, it kind of does that, but it kind of is watered down, and Kyiv wasn't happy about that. Another article, the divided G20 statement angers Kyiv, new drone fragments found in Romania. This one said, quote, the statement underlined the, quote, human suffering and negative added impacts of the war in Ukraine, but did not mention Russia's invasion. And that's really the long and short of that. Now, there were also new drone fragments found in Romania. And now Romania has to kind of start thinking about what happens when they do it the next time. And I did another video about that. You can go back and see that as well. Okay, Danube ports are now targets, and the people on the Danube were like, wow, we didn't think we were going to be in the war. We're so close to the border of Romania. Certainly, Russia wouldn't do it, but it's becoming a fact of life there. Kyiv residents, this was a fascinating article. It was really weird. Kyiv residents fear a property grab. And so what happens is a building gets destroyed in Kyiv. Well, that's still prime real estate into the future. And so property developers want to develop it. Quote, what hasn't been destroyed by the Russian rockets is being destroyed by our officials and our builders, read one placard of people protesting when they were saying the building's condemned. The war, perhaps surprisingly, has not diminished the appetite for prime property in Kyiv or halted the scramble to get a hold of empty plots for construction. What the Russians began, the city council is trying to finish off, she said. Even if our building isn't sound, I don't understand why they can't use the money to rebuild. Why do they want to move us away? And what do they plan to do with the land? So residents whose homes have been destroyed are being moved elsewhere, which is understandable, but they're not being allowed to live back where they are. And developers want to come in and like it kind of stinks of corruption, but it may not be. It may just be this is the safest plan, but it kind of looks bad. Okay, Sunday, 10 September, last little bit. RT says the Biden aide intervenes to end rambling press conference. Now I watched this on Twitter and it did look weird because he started to ramble and then somebody interrupted him and said, okay, it's time to wrap to go, or whatever it was that ended the thing. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. And like, you don't cut off the president of the United States while he's talking, but because he kind of was not really, I'm not sure where he was going with his point. They kind of cut him off, and it was a weird look. Okay, Lavrov says G20 was a success. Well, to his mind, sure it was. I mean, the aggressor, the burglar breaking into the house, got to have a say about violence and how you should strongly not word the language. And yeah, you can watch that other video and see what I'm talking about later on today. Brazil's Lula says that Putin can attend next year's G20 without fear of arrest. Quote, what I can tell you is that if I'm Brazil's president and he comes to Brazil, there will be no reason that he'll be arrested, says Lula. Okay, so that wraps up what happened as of yesterday. Today is Monday, September 11th. And because it's September 11th, we also want to take some time and reflect on those innocent lives that were lost and all that happened as a consequence of that. So thank you for joining me in that time of reflection. I really just urge you to do that today. This was a tremendous tragedy, not just for the United States, but I mean, that we kind of lost our innocence on 9/11, at least in the United States, where we just thought, wow, I mean, it was quite a day, and I remember it vividly. Thank you for listening to me this far. Thank you for the likes, the shares, the subscribes, the coffees, and thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine. I know I usually end it there, but I want to say this. What's happening in Ukraine is important, like what happened on 9/11, because what happens here affects the rest of the world, just like what happened on 9/11 affected the rest of the world. We're not isolated. I'm not a globalist, but we're not isolated. We have to live together on this planet, and we can't ignore what's going on in Ukraine.